Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Alice Gent, the chair of the CIWEM Scottish branch, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first of the CIWEM Scottish branch webinars, which we'll be holding in place of our normal evening meetings for at least the next 2 months in light of COVID-19. We regretfully had to postpone our poster competition and networking event, which was being supported by Crew and Vibes, but hope to rearrange for autumn-winter later this year. In the meantime, we've got a number of events which we have organised as webinars. So today's one by Rebecca Passmore of Fairhurst, talking to us about the role of an ECOW, and then another event in April on the 29th, NFM in Scotland, a presentation by Barry Hankin of JBA, talking about the Eddleston water modelling. In May, we then have two webinars by Scottish Water, the first on the 6th of May by Christine Murray, talking about water quality policies and aiming for achieving 100% compliance with drinking water standards, followed by an event on the 27th of May by Wastewater Treatment Systems. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Rebecca Passmore, who will be our presenter for this evening, who is going to inform us about the role of an environmental clerk of works. Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks for joining us today, and welcome to the webinar on ECOW. We'll distract you from, briefly at least, from a lot of the events which are going on around us. And hopefully also some of you are more familiar with the role. You may have wondered whether I've chosen a controversial title or not. But when I was reflecting on the title, to come up with the title, I think for me this actually really distills a lot of the work which the association is doing at the moment. We want to raise awareness of some of the issues that we've got with the role, and help develop it. So I'll take you on a journey. But in order to do this, we're going to look at a few different factors, essentially, which affect the role. So I'll just give a very brief overview of the role, because some of you may not be so familiar with it. So just a slide or two on that. And then we'll look at other things like the planning system, and I'll touch on types of contracts and behaviours as well. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll see, if you're not already aware, that it is actually really quite a complex role to deliver, with lots of different factors affecting it. But also I wanted to take the opportunity to highlight a lot of the opportunities as well. It's a new role, it's still very much developing, and we do believe there are a lot of opportunities still that we can work with in order to make improvements. So before I jump into the main body of the presentation, just wanted to take a few moments, because I'm not sure who's actually watching this or not, just a couple of moments just to give you an overview of the association for those who aren't familiar with it. We are a small group of volunteers who run it in our own time. The main aim for us this year really is to deliver our strategy. We've been working on our strategy for the last couple of years. We've had quite a few resource issues because we are just a small group of volunteers. But this year we're engaging with partners and stakeholders to define and implement the role. So we're working on the commissioning of it, and also promoting the role as well. There needs to be a lot more clarity. You'll pick up on through the presentation. But I would encourage you that if you are interested in this role, or you're quite close to this role, please do go and have a look at our strategy, which is on our website, and anyone can download it. And just a quick plug, if any ECOWs out there, or people who work closely with the ECOWs are interested in joining the association, you can also have a look at our events and training program that we have on our website. We've actually just finished a training program which was about a year long, where we tried to put on a webinar and event every month, sorry, for 12 months. We just didn't do one in the summer and in Christmas, so I think we actually put on about 10 events. But as I said, now what we're trying to do is focus on the delivery of our strategy, which is essentially raising standards within the industry. Also trying to create a professional community and network. So if anyone's interested in setting up local networks, that's something which is on our agenda to deliver this year. without further ado, I'll just quickly gloss over this. As Alice said, I work for Fairhurst. I'm Principal Environmental Consultant. I started off my career at CEPA after I did my Masters in Water and Environmental Management. Everything I focus on, although I'm an environmental consultant, is water management. I basically sit on the consenting and regulatory side of the scale of the environmental management side of things. I actually got involved with the association myself when I was having a few issues being an ECOW and delivering that role, and I got in touch with the association when I attended their conference, and yeah, I've been with the committee for now about 3 or 4 years, I think. So to begin with, what is an ECOW? The association currently defines it as an environmental or construction professional with direct responsibility for monitoring compliance with environmental legislation, policy, or mitigation. So essentially we see this, the association sees the role as monitoring, compliance, and an advisory role as well. So ultimately, and more often than not, the brief of an ECOW is almost always, or frequently anyway, defined by the wording of a planning condition. And that's where we as an association have targeted our effort and effort this year or over the last few months in order to get this right. In order for the role to have real credibility, the design and implementation work can't normally be done or carried out by the same person who's doing the compliance monitoring and assessment of it. The role is a relatively new role, as I mentioned. There's still quite a lot of teething issues, we believe, as an association, which we're trying to address. It's a very broad role as well. So you do have a very broad understanding of a wide range of environmental legislation and regulations. But obviously, as an environmental specialist, you're a non-engineer usually working in an engineering world. So you know, there can be a lot of conflict. And I know George Fleming, who set up the association, he had this ethos, and I also believe it as well, that we need to bring the engineers and the non-engineers, or the engineers and the environmental people closer together so they can understand each other and each other's drivers, essentially to be able to communicate better. So there's a more coherent delivery particularly of large-scale projects or construction projects. So we recognise that there are a lot of challenges that our members face working as non-engineers in this engineering world. We're essentially the eyes and ears for the planning authorities as well, because it's a compliance monitoring role, not only the planning authorities, but also regulators and developers. The ECOW must be impartial and unbiased. And also just to say, when I refer to ECOW, I'm referring to an environmental clerks of works, which is the umbrella term, not an ecological clerk of works, which is obviously an ecology specialist. So every time I say ECOW, it's environmental clerk of works. And they must be impartial and they must be unbiased. So there's no conflict of interest. But by definition, it's rarely appropriate for an ECOW to be direct employee of the contractor. Independence is required, because otherwise we believe as an association you are creating a conflict of interest there by reporting compliance directly to the person who's commissioned you. So we're aware of a lot of the issues that are in the industry which relate to this commissioning perspective. We're aware it happens a lot. And you know, we do believe that it's a squeeze on resources, and it's a merging of two different roles. It's a merging of, or it's a symptomatic of reducing environmental resources, where effectively you've got an environmental advisor role combined with an environmental clerk of works role. Essentially, the ECOW role combines an understanding of the natural environment and also the construction process. So we believe that qualifications and experience are both equally important to delivering the role. And we would always encourage ECOWs to also have a professional certification. So being a member of an institute, particularly like CIWEM, or CIWEM or IEMA potentially, depending on what your background is. But we definitely value the experience as well as qualifications. One is not good enough on its own, essentially, because it's such a complicated role to deliver. So as we said before, the ECOW is there primarily to deliver, to monitor the compliance and the delivery of the development. And often that is the monitoring of the implementation of SEMPs, so construction environmental management plans, mitigation plans, or schedule of commitments. There's different types of terminology. But essentially, we're often reporting, at least I was trained to report under 3 different banners. So you're reporting compliance in relation to planning conditions, or the plans directly associated with the development. Or the next one would be under legislation and regulatory compliance. And the third one would be in line with good practice or guidelines. So we would often basically break down the report under those three different titles. So the contractor and also the developer could easily see what you were reporting in line with, because it, understandably, it is quite complicated when you're advising on these 3 different broad areas. When you're acting as an ECOW, obviously, like any other job, it's really important why you understand why you're commissioned, because the role and responsibilities do vary quite a lot from job to job. So you really need to understand the scope of works, and if they're not clearly defined, you need to make an effort in order to define them and get agreement with them. A huge amount of the issues which we see and experience and hear about are often to do with when problems arise and scenarios maybe haven't been discussed. So, there's a huge amount of difference of opinion. For example, what might constitute pollution to one person might not constitute pollution to another. So, what's expected of your role? What are the reporting mechanisms? What are the expected responses from you? Who are your key personnel? So try and map out the role if it's not been mapped out for you. And what we find is that often the roles aren't clearly mapped out. So the ECOW basically needs to understand their role very clearly and have it agreed, but before commencing, ideally, obviously. So why isn't ECOW commissioned? Well, the ECOW is commissioned because they have, or they should have a sound understanding of environmental legislation. That's actually totally paramount if they're going to deliver the role successfully. They don't have to be a specialist in each of the areas, but they have to have a broad understanding at least and know the limits of their skills and their experience, and also then when to pull in specialists. As I alluded to, there are many different regulatory regimes and environmental legislation. Here's the main sort of 5 areas are on the screen, and underneath those 5 areas, there's lots and lots and lots of sub-regulatory regimes as well. But it's important to also recognise as an ECOW that you are there also, the role has been designed to support development. So whilst you're monitoring compliance as an advisory ECOW, you should be able to work with contractors and developers in order to advise them potentially, for example, where there might be potential near misses, or you can see arisings are going to potentially have an effect. So it's a proactive role. But as I said before, you need to be aware of where your skills and experience stop, or where you're getting to the limits of them. And then when you go and find a specialist, it's really important to know where those limits are, and also discuss them with the contract manager or your site agent or whoever you're working with closely, so they understand your the reporting mechanisms as well. So the ECOW can be broadly commissioned by 2 very different ways. Well, it can either be voluntary, which I have to say doesn't happen so much, but the voluntary commission is when a contractor or a developer recognises the value in what an ECOW can bring to a project, has obviously had good experiences of a project, feels its value for money, and will, you know, proactively reduce environmental risk, or at least manage it and minimise it as much as possible. I've personally only worked on one project, which was voluntary. It was a large wind farm in a very, very sensitive area. It wasn't a requirement of the planning consent to have an ECOW, but it was actually the contractor with the site agent who brought in the ECOW voluntarily. As I said, most commissions are mandatory, so they're through the planning system, and that can either obviously be through a planning condition itself, or through an environmental permit. So the two broad types of ECOW, which the association recognises. The first one is an auditor, which is, as you can probably tell by the name, it's a passive role. So it's monitoring compliance of the conditions and any associated plans in a passive form. It doesn't include proactive support. It basically just records, you know, its eyes and ears essentially, without actually engaging in the construction process. The ECOW would still normally be expected to make routine site visits, review site conditions, environmental logs, produce environmental logs. It's often, I consider this an auditing role to be quite similar to the planning monitoring officer role, for people who are more familiar with that phrase. The advisory role is very much the majority of commissions. You do obviously, as a developer or a contractor, get a lot more value for money, it could be argued, because you are engaging and feeding back in terms of giving advice on either issues or potential issues. It's often also usually used on the bigger, more complex sites as well, or maybe where the sensitivities aren't understood so well. But essentially this role does provide ongoing support and advice. And it doesn't just monitor and report, essentially in a passive way, which the auditor does. You might work on sites. Some of the bigger sites definitely have teams of ECOWs as well. So in a scenario where you might have two types of ECOW commissioned, for example, I know SSE work under the model where the principal contractor has an advisory ECOW, and in order to reduce or remove the conflict of interest there, SSE retain their own auditing ECOW team as well. So really it's because the commissions and the appointments, as we'll come on to look at, does create this conflict of interest. And so that's essentially one of the main reasons why you would have an auditing role as well as an advisory role. Essentially one's working on behalf of the developer, the other one's working on behalf of the contractor. The auditing role doesn't have to necessarily go to site. That's the other thing that's also worth noteworthy. The auditing can actually be done from desk base, and it would be a lot less resource heavy than the actual site-based one, because essentially what the auditor's doing is reviewing the reports and checking essentially that they believe that they see, you know, what they're reviewing essentially stands up. You know, a site agent or a non-specialist in environmental legislation or a non-environmentalist wouldn't, you know, obviously be able to see some of the nuances in that. So, you know, it does what it says on the tin. It is auditing the advisory role often. So to go back to the question of is it box ticking or is it truly effective? We need to look at the main factors, and I think a lot of the main factors are also challenges, but they're also opportunities. And there is a very wide range of them. I've distilled down, when I was reflecting on this, I've distilled it down into these 5 broad areas. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on them, but it's just to give you a flavour of you know, what the ECOW role is affected by, and obviously what they have to deal with as well. So the purpose of the planning condition relating to the ECOW is to provide the consenting body and stakeholders with a mean of monitoring the management of environmental risks. However, where the ECOW planning conditions are more ambiguous, the authority of the ECOW on site is likely to be diminished, as the structure isn't there to support the role. And this is where you can start getting into quite grey areas, or issues can arise. As most of you are probably aware, I'm going to assume that you're reasonably familiar with EIA. Obviously, planning conditions are drafted in response to the findings of an EIA. Sometimes the EIA can be quite optimistic. Sometimes it can be difficult / sometimes impossible to provide the mitigation or to be compliant during construction or post-consent, at least in terms of dealing with what's been essentially promised in an EIA. Environmental consultants are often sometimes optimistic, shall we say, in what can be delivered during construction. Pre-planning teams essentially can promise a lot to gain a consent. And I think this is something this will be a theme that I'll just be raising as something that needs to be, I think, bringing together the pre-planning teams with the post-planning and construction teams is a real opportunity to understand what happens either side of the planning consent, essentially. Because what we want to reduce from a planning perspective is essentially commitments, mitigation, or technical infeasibilities which prevent a development not being constructed in a compliant way. I did read about a hydropower scheme which has been consented, where the contractor or the preferred contractor did a walkover of the site with the consent and concluded that it actually wasn't possible to build the hydropower scheme within the bounds of the consent. So that just gives you a demonstration of what I mean. So the planning system is usually the main driver for the ECOW role. And during development planning process, planning authorities are legally required to consider environmental effects of the development. So you'll be familiar with this if you're an environmental consultant, but the bulk of the work consultants do relates to the planning system and provides evidence for the planning applications to obtain consent. So for some projects, it's known if there are, I think it's a Schedule 1 under the EIA regs, for example, large transport infrastructure, an EIA is always going to be required. Hopefully EIA is something familiar to you, but it is quite a complicated process, and the bigger the projects get, the more complicated it gets. I thought I knew what EIA and had worked on EIA for quite a long time until I started working on major road schemes. And it went up a whole nother level of complexity. So I mean, every day is a school day, but unless you've worked on massive projects, yeah, I guess the point being is that it's very complicated and there are design iterations. The whole process is obviously designed to examine environmental impacts in great detail, particularly the larger the scale or the magnitude of the developments are. And essentially what it results in is a statement of significance and a very detailed schedule of mitigation. And it's that schedule of mitigation, which I'm just going to hang on to as a theme. So as I've said before, the EIA manages risk by monitoring, and there can be many design iterations through the design development. And at the end, essentially at the end of it, the schedule of mitigation, or sometimes it's called a schedule of commitments, is one of the main outputs of an EIA, or an EIA report, as they're called. In summary, that's the residual risks that could not be designed out. So they're going to be managed as what they're proposing, or the consultants are proposing, is that environmental risk will be managed and minimized by this mitigation. And often an ECOW is a mitigation, or is a part of a schedule of mitigation, because there are known effects on the environment which are going to occur, and the way they're going to be managed and minimised is by having an ECOW present. So an ECOW obviously prepares their reports, but who reads these reports and who ensures that they are acted upon? What I've found working on major infrastructure projects anyway is that I do believe there is a culture, or rather that, you know, there obviously are a lot of factors as we're working our way through now which influence the role. And I believe in order to get more control and clarity, there needs to be development of the role further earlier on in the system. When I've worked on projects, a lot of the time the schedule of commitment will just set, schedule of commitments or mitigation will often just say there will be an ECOW, and the ECOW is expected magically to then manage all of the environmental risks at a project. So I think essentially kicking the can down the road in terms of development is not helpful. I think it builds risk and it creates a lot of problems for the people who are actually delivering it on the ground. And that's not just the ECOW, that can be you know, the project team as well, bearing in mind how big these teams can get. I think leaving the description of the ECOW and the roles and responsibilities till after post-development is not necessarily a helpful thing. One aspect which I personally experienced a few years ago is, you know, the ECOW can be there and there can be a scope of works, but then what is the feedback mechanism for accountability, particularly on the findings of what the compliance assessments or reporting is saying. So, for example, I as a water quality person, I do a lot of monitoring of obviously different surface waters, and we have monitored on different projects, and particularly one project that I can think of, we monitored and we watched and we advised on quite a serious pollution incident which happened over quite a number of days. We reported in line with the planning conditions and everything the way it had been set up. But that didn't mean that the contractor, there was a loophole, and the contractor didn't have to necessarily respond in a particular way when pollution was identified. So I think there's a bit of a not a loophole, but a lack of addressing what the ECOW role is at earlier stage in the development, and particularly more thought for you know, from the EIA perspectives, particularly in terms of the schedule of mitigation, what exactly is the role going to do for that development. So I'm not going to dwell on contracts because it's absolutely not my area. I have colleagues which I normally go and speak to when we have contract issues or discussions. But really what I wanted to put in here is because it is actually vitally important to the role, and also understanding what influences the role. I'm not going to go into detail, but what I will highlight is the fact that there are a vast amount of time is spent in the construction project on contracts. Consultants ones are usually relatively straightforward. We don't go into so much detail for consultants contracts at all, whereas the construction contracts are very much based on, it's a process is about assumption and quantity surveying and estimators, to set forward costs for the construction according to assumptions about materials, ground conditions and supply costs. It's the NEC4 family of contracts normally forms the basis of a construction contract in the UK. And although you don't need to understand it in full details, it is worth at least being aware of the NEC4 contract templates. They're very much focused around ongoing amendments and iterations. And sometimes this can often cause delays. So, you know, when you hear issues with contract delays, it really goes down to the type of contract that's involved, and particularly the ones that we work under generally anyway, the NEC4 contracts. all I would say is to the ECOWs who are out there, it's just being worth aware of them. It's, you know, the construction jobs are governed by them. So you should at least have some sort of knowledge or awareness of what that means for you. Essentially, it's a delegation of risk. ECOW responsibilities are passed down through the contracts to the contractor often. But yeah, you should probably just make yourself aware of the NEC for contracts if you're not. But essentially, the delegation of risk is in relation to the design liability and the risk transference. So what's really crucial in all of that is having clear lines of communication, particularly for the ECOWs, but also understanding or at least appreciating that contracts do influence behaviours. They influence behaviours at a project level and also from a company perspective and also on an individual level as well. So I think, you know, something that I've picked up on working on different projects and particularly with a colleague of mine anyway, who I've worked with for a few years, he's very much taps into what makes people drive, what makes people tick and what influences their behaviours. And contracts are part of that. So here, just bullet pointed a few factors which affect developers. Obviously, all developers exist to make money, which is absolutely fine as a fact of life and what makes the world go round sometimes. But what I wanted to touch on as well is that it's not just about you know, money. There is a culture in different companies and different developments. You know, what is the corporate environmental responsibility of a particular company? How seriously do they take it? It's often, you know, it's top down. It's not down to individuals per se on the ground delivering. I'm a firm believer that, you know, everything is top down in a company. So if you only have to spend a short amount of time at a site or in meetings with a company for you to get an understanding of how seriously they take their environmental responsibilities and what their priorities are, you know, is compliance not necessarily so important to them? Potentially, if you realise that they're, you know, willing to cut corners, essentially, in order to save a few bob. So again, just bullet pointing you know, a huge amount of variables which affect people's contractors' behaviours. Where does environmental compliance fit in with this? You know, all these different variables, and it's really difficult to see actually when you start looking at it from, you know, a contractor or a developer's perspective. It is really complicated to understand whether, you know, you could distill it down into being environmental compliance. But when there are so many competing pressures, and obviously money being usually one of the highest ones, it is really difficult to understand where the ECOW role and environmental compliance fits in. But essentially, the association want to see the ECOW role given appropriate resources and status within developments. So it's recognised, the support that it can offer is recognised in order to maximise compliance and practices. So ultimately, you know, having an ECOW, a supportive ECOW there is a good thing, and it should support the development. It shouldn't be perceived as barriers, because at the end of the day, it should, a good, experienced and qualified ECOW should be able to influence the quality of the product at the end of the day and the quality of the build. Nobody wants to project, well, no responsible developer wants cheap product at the end of the day. Don't really want to cut corners if it's going to affect you, particularly if it's going to affect the quality of your product and potentially compromise your compliance. So, as you know, as humans, although I quite like this picture of a badger, ECOWs obviously subject to the same influences. You know, they're just coming at a project from a different perspective. But you know, as people, I think we've already covered some of the main factors which affect, you know, the same factors affect the contractor and the developer and the ECOW often. But really what I wanted to highlight is the fact that there are differences of backgrounds, and as I alluded to earlier about the engineers, or rather the non-engineers working in an engineering world, a lot of the issues which we see and hear about, I think come down to communication a lot of the time, and also just understanding what the role is there, and getting clarity on the role in the first instance. You know, obviously how the commission is, how the ECOW is commissioned in the first place, whether it's voluntary or mandatory, would immediately indicate, you know, what level of engagement. If it's voluntary, that's a really good sign, because as I said before, that you know, the client or the contractor has seen the value and they want you there voluntarily. If you're working with a planning condition which has been poorly worded and is very open to interpretation or is ambiguous, you're starting at quite a challenging point. And the first thing to do is unpick that ambiguous condition and agree it with the planning authority and well, first the client, whether it's developer or contractor, but also with the planning authority, so everyone is clear, understanding what the role is about, and have you got the amount of resources that you need in order to deliver it. You know, are you being asked to do a 5-day job but one day a week? Do you have support? Do you have the necessary technical people to pull in? If you've got, you know, bats at site, you don't want to have a Japanese knotweed specialist sent to you. So, you know, obviously just because it's environmental doesn't mean that you can start straying into different areas. So the resources really are to do with the specialist skills, and also depending on the way the project has been set up, are you comfortable delivering that role, or are you being asked to do more? Are you being asked to cross into a design and implementation role? In which case the association, you know, would look at that potentially as being a merging of two roles: the environmental advisor role with the ECOW role as well. So basically, I'm just going to go over the same things, which are essentially just turn the challenges into the opportunities. I've jumped around a little bit, but you'll see the same themes coming through again. We definitely feel as an association that there's clarity to bring to the role through defining it. We're working pretty hard at the moment with some of the regulators in order to define the role. We believe that once it's been defined, that will really take away a lot of the ambiguity that ECOWs often find themselves dealing with. I believe, just touching on the EIAs, that to keep things as simple as possible and realistic as possible is also key. The last schedule of commitments that I've worked with was nearly 80 pages long. And how you turn that into a contract with all the other information that needs to go with it. I mean, it's an absolute minefield. I am now very much of the opinion to keep it as simple as possible. There's obviously a balance to be struck, because if you don't want to keep it too simple, so simple where obviously you've got gaps and you're missing things. So it is about getting the balance right between keeping it, you know, not being too prescriptive, but being reasonably flexible as well, and being realistic. It's not in anybody's favour to work with planning conditions and planning consent, which are impossible to deliver. You know, that's absolutely futile, and nobody's here to build something in a non-compliant way, or nobody sets out to build things in a non-compliant way anyway. So I think, just in short, I think bringing together the pre-planning teams and the post-planning teams, or the construction teams, so each other understands the different phases, and really can appreciate what is required, particularly at a later stage and during construction, to keeping it as realistic as possible. Technical infeasibility when you've got a consent is really not a good place for a development to be in. Something which I've become more familiar with over the last couple of years is buildability assessments. The first time I heard the word buildability, I thought someone was having a laugh. I had no idea what they meant. However, now becoming more familiar with what a buildability assessment is, I absolutely see their value. So that just basically is an example of what I mean by bringing the pre-construction or the pre-planning and the post-construction closer together, and reducing likelihood of technical infeasibilities. So as I said, it's really important to agree the basic principles of an appointment. And we think the starting point as association is embedding the role in the planning system. However, we are asking ourselves quite hard at the moment with our stakeholders and the people we're engaging with, is the ECOW an individual with direct responsibility to monitor compliance, or is there a design element to the role? We've come across a lot of ECOWs recently who have had a design and implementation element to their role essentially foisted on them or expected of them. We believe at the current position at the moment, and as I said, we are going through some consultation about this, but we believe if it's a monitoring compliance role, you can't be designing and implementing the design in the first place. You can't, somebody used quite a good analogy recently about, it's like you having a driving test, a driving instructor pass himself as a driver. We believe that's a conflict of interest. So we're working quite hard in order to differentiate between the role of environmental advisor, who's essentially an in-house advisor, and the ECOW, which should be an independent role which monitors compliance. So I just wanted to touch on briefly these three guidance. Hopefully it's you who are consultants or ECOWs out there are familiar with them. The one on the left was updated last year, which we input into. That's the Scottish Renewables, or S&H one and Scottish Renewables. The one in the centre is our own guidance, which I would point you to in the first instance actually, in terms of how we believe planning conditions should be written and what should be involved in terms of resources and setting out scopes of work and that kind of thing. It's quite brief, it's only a few pages long, so hopefully you can go and have a look at that if you've not seen it before. The hydropower one is one that we also fed into last year. We're very aware that these documents are Scottish heavy. We are trying through our strategy to reach out to regulators who are in different parts of the UK. So if you are interested in getting in touch, or you know other people in different parts of the UK that use guidance or who have contacts with regulators, we would be very, very happy to talk to you. So please do get in touch. I didn't particularly, if you are familiar with guidance documents, I didn't on purpose put up the Highland Council one. The reason I haven't put that up is because when I actually went to look at it, there is some terminology in there that, which I think we wouldn't necessarily agree with as an association. The association, and for example, the main wording which they used, which is a bit of a common trap which we see being used quite a lot, is this word ensure. Now, we've put this slide up. If you've seen other presentations of ours before, then you'll recognise this one, because it's a bugbear of ours where the role is, the pure role of an ECOW as it stands, as the association recognises it, is the role does not ensure anything. It monitors compliance. Ensuring is what an environmental advisor could do, or somebody who's working more on behalf of the designer. So hopefully we've covered the difference between who does what in terms of monitor design and implementation. And it's the Highland Council I actually saw use this word quite a lot. So it's something that I think we'll be picking up with them shortly to see if we can feed into the next iteration of their guidance on SEMPs. I'm just seeing the time, so I'm going to rush through the last couple of slides. Again, just in terms of opportunities, obviously this ties into the themes that I've already been outlining, but what I do see is that how complicated the process is, and particularly the contracts. I think there needs to be more clarity on when commitments must be implemented, and improvements on communication, lines of communication and reporting. This wouldn't necessarily fall under a contract per se in terms of the NEC, But it would be interesting to see how we can make the environmental commitments clearer for everybody, because I do feel like it is a minefield, and that's why there's so many grey areas and traps which people fall into. Procurement was the other thing that I just wanted to mention on contracts. You'll be aware that there's a lot of quality versus cost, and I'm pleased to see now, working on government programmes, that there is now more points from procurement given to quality than there was cost. It used to be 90, from a public sector perspective, it used to be awarded 90% on cost and 10% on quality. I believe it's now moved to 70% cost, 30% quality, and I understand it's going to move again, which is really pleasing to hear about. And this is just really what I wanted to sum up in terms of what I was touching on earlier: qualifications and experience, professional, not necessarily chartered, but at least a member of a body should be really required of practitioners. And also codes of conduct, so you know that you're working with somebody who's professional. Yeah, I'll just sum up now because I've obviously realised I'm running on quite a bit. But here, hopefully this just brings together the themes that I was talking about. It's really to do with clarifying, defining the role in the planning system is what we're trying to achieve as an association, and taking that right back to the earliest points in the development chain. Learning from other regulatory mechanisms which have also achieved this cultural change. We believe as an association that the construction industry has to go through something similar to what it's gone through with health and safety. You know, everybody, we use this analogy quite frequently, and it's a good one because everybody knows their responsibilities on a construction site, and you know, everyone's accountable, and that is not the case for environmental legislation or compliance at the moment. And I think we still have a few painful years to go through until you know, we're more on a par with other regulatory regimes like health and safety. I think I've touched on all of those, but what I wanted to show you just as a final slide was to demonstrate that point, which is to do with, this is a really interesting graph, which I pinched from a colleague's presentation, I have to say. But you can see clearly when there's been innovation in the, amendments in regulations, how that has infected this is actually, I think, the mortality rate of workers. And you can see where there's downward trends when there has been these amendments from the regulations which have been made. So from 1996 onwards, you can see it goes down. There's a little peak again afterwards at the end of the 90s, and then it goes down again to the next one, which is in 2007. It's then, the mortality rate is then driven down further again. And then obviously after the CDM regulations in 2015, mortality rate has been driven down again. And I think that's a really interesting picture, just to visualize it. And I think basically we need to go through these regulatory changes in the environmental sector as well. And it's only when, you know, there is direct accountability, and it was really when directors were made personally accountable for health and safety, did you see the standards really ramping up. So hopefully that just summarises one of the main points that I wanted to finish on. And yeah, if there's any questions or coming through, I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but I'll wait for someone to tell me something.
Rebecca, that was wonderful. Thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome. I've just got a chat up now. So do you want to read questions to me, or do you want me to just read them off the screen?
I think Ollie's going to direct questions, but yeah, if you can see them as well, that'll give you a heads up of the ones that are coming through.
Okay.
Are you able to see the questions, Rebecca? Have you found that option? Cool. Okay. So
I'm fairly simple though. I can't speak and read at the same time.
Okay, so we'll go with the first question from Michael, and that is, where can I get a copy of the ECOW documents?
So if you're talking about the planning document, it's on our website. Just to let you know, our current website is just being rebuilt. It is live and available now, so it's on the screen now, the website address, so it's ae.com. If you Google, if you go to the news, if you go to the news page, it's on there. But actually, if you Google it, that's often the quickest way that I find it as well. If you just put into Google, it will come back. It's for planning authorities.
Excellent. And then we've got 3 questions from Niru, and I might as well read them all out. So, is there a register for professional qualified ECOWs? How are ECOWs sourced for the project, especially like you said earlier, when specific skills are required? And how does the industry ensure quality and competence of those hired?
Yeah, quite different questions, so I'll just take them one by one.
Sure.
The Register of Professionally Qualified ECOWs. So there isn't a register as such. Our new website, which we're building, has actually will have the functionality to search for our members. So we're hoping to launch it, we were hoping to launch it in May, but obviously just with the world upside down at the moment, everything's taking a little bit longer, but you would be a registered member of ours, at which point, in terms of qualifications, there's no actual ECOW qualifications as such. However, there is, I know that scheme is developing their own accredited scheme, and I'm aware that Naturally Compliant has also just launched a course with the West of Scotland recently. So I can't remember, sorry, I don't know the details of what the qualification is, but when we talk about qualifications, we're obviously talking about individual environmental qualifications, not an ECOW qualification as such. But as I said, there isn't training and development starting to come through, and the West of Scotland and CIWEM being 2 sources. I know CIWEM's is taking a lot longer than they envisaged though. Sorry, I've already forgotten the other 2 questions. You're gonna have to...
So how would an ECOW normally be sourced for a project?
Well, often it's, what I found anyway is that if it's an EIA or they've had environmental consultants working on the project, if the developer is happy with them, they often retain them and continue to be that ECOW. Often also they're put out to competitive tender. So, through procurement departments, companies often have preferred consultants who they go to, but often it's put out to tender, and unless it's a small company, and they can keep it in-house and just go to straight to the ECOW that they want to use again.
Okay. And then, Niru's last question was, how does the industry ensure quality and competence of those ECOWs hired?
Well, it's really difficult, and the short answer is they can't, which is why we stress the qualifications, that we push the professional bodies and the experience and combining all together. Obviously, we recognise that people start their careers at some point. So if you're a graduate or a junior ECOW, when you're at site, you should always, you should be shadowing a more experienced person, because it's inappropriate to put a junior ECOW on a complicated, particularly on a complicated site. Now, there are different aspects to the job, so they could, a junior or a graduate could definitely do some of the, the nest checks or the surveys, which might be part of the role. However, delivering, attending meetings and going through compliance reports is not something that a junior person should have to do. We encourage men, essentially shadowing and encourage people to mentor, because it is such a tricky role to deliver. We steer clear from the word ensure. Nobody can ensure anything practically. In my opinion, it's a completely overused word. All you can do is have reasonably tight criteria in terms of procurement for making sure that you have qualifications, experience, professional memberships, all the usual aspects, I guess, which professionals are expected to have anyway.
Okay, and that probably brings us on to another question from Irene, which they've asked, can you ask for the word ensuring to be removed if we come across it and change to monitoring?
We would advocate that, but it depends on who you ask it. I mean, I'm going to assume here that you're talking about a client or in a contract. It is definitely something which should be discussed. It really goes back to liability and responsibilities, accountabilities. We are very much aware of the issues around this, and we're very much aware that people operate under these clauses and are expected to do that, but it's definitely worth discussion. And if you can change it, there is an opportunity to change it, then yes, you should. At the end of the day, unless you have the authority or the power, which generally you won't, how can you ensure anything? But to be honest, I think the word is generally overused all the time. Just to give you a flavour, I fed back on the plans which were put out, the sector plans which CIPA put out about a year ago or whenever it was for consultation. And the sector plan which I fed back on, I did a controlled find on ensure, and there were, I remember from memory, there was 34 uses of the word ensure. Very few people can ensure anything unless you have the power you have the control in order to do that. I think it's a bit of a tokenistic word. So I would encourage Irene to do that if they can.
Cool. Another question from Ashling. Is there consistency across regulators / planning authorities through Scotland in terms of ECOW requirements and mitigation?
Absolutely not. I left out some of the details when the presentation about that actually when I saw I was slipping in time, but no, that is exactly what we are working on as an association at the moment. There is very little consistency, and each planning authority works in their own way, essentially. We as an association are engaging with the Heads of Planning Service Scotland, which is HOPS. I don't know if people have heard that frame, HOPS, but it's obviously the body of 32 or 33 different regions. We're trying to get to the source of the planning authorities, and also we're trying to inform the NFP4 next, which is out for consultation at the moment and due to be published next year, because the inconsistency is huge, basically, and that's a source of a lot of problems. I don't think it's just Scotland, to be honest. I think it's the wider regions, countries, and we would really like to encourage people to get involved if they're in different parts of the country, because we're very aware that we're Scotland heavy and we don't want to be.
We've got another question from Sally. Do you have an opinion on the fines, penalties for non-compliance compared to the cost of implementing the mitigation measures? Are the fines high enough? ? And if anyone here was at the Naturally Compliant presentation a month or so ago, I think this was brought up by another member of the audience. So what was your opinion on that, Rebecca?
It is really interesting, and obviously it's one of the main factors about which also influences behaviour. You know, I'm an environmental professional, so I actually have to curb a lot of what I say when I'm working with construction engineers. My personal opinion, which I'll speak for now, is that absolutely not. They're not high enough. When I see fines, my natural reaction is to want to stick another 3 zeros on the end of them, because it's carrot and stick in terms of regulations. And if you look at, if you take examples of how much a project costs, there's projects which I've worked on which have been £5 billion, and then so if you've got a fine for £10,000, what was the point? It's not even a drop in the ocean. So the reason the job is so difficult is because the regulatory backing essentially isn't there, in my opinion. The fines need to ramp up. I know there are more powers that CIPA recently have. I know the EA is quite good at taking forward their prosecutions. I think the model that the EA has is pretty good and effective, because they do get pretty big sums. The difficulty with Scotland is that we have the proprietary fiscal process, which is a very different law model, and it can be quite difficult for environmental cases to get taken forward. However, the EA take their own cases forward, have their own legal team that they do, obviously do their own work internally rather than having to go to the PF. Scottish Water, I know, for example, a couple of years ago were fined £21 million. And I fully support that. And when you look at how much that affected them, apparently that was 1 day of their operating fees for 1 day out of the year. So in the greater scheme of things, it does have to be relative. The fines have to go up in order to make the system work, essentially, because they're not big enough in relation to the mitigation.
Okay, and we'll have one final question there, and we'll leave it there for people to go for their for their tea. And thanks for the presentation, Rebecca. So Rebecca Wade asks, thank you for the presentation, Rebecca, really interesting and informative. What do you think are the next big challenges and opportunities for the ECOW role?
Well, for us, it's getting buy-in, stakeholder agreement and buy-in with the definition. We've also, right at the beginning of our consultation, we've actually we've got a lot of differences of opinions. We as an association, we want to avoid saying it's our way or the highway. You know, we want to go through a consultative process. However, we do recognise it's going to be potentially quite challenging getting not only practitioners, but you know, all sorts of stakeholders on board with what the definition is. And what we're proving is particularly difficult at the moment is defining the difference between an environmental advisor and an ECOW. I think that's actually going to be one of the biggest hurdles. Once we've sorted that out, I think there's actually going to be a relatively, I'm not going to say plain sailing, but I think that is actually the backbone of a lot of the issues we're experiencing already. And once it's defined and embedded in planning frameworks, in theory, a lot of the guidance and other issues will follow on from there. But personally, I think that's the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity.
Excellent, thank you. It's normally this point where we do a round of applause, but I think we'll have to do a virtual one from all of our random places that we're watching.
Thanks. Sorry I went on a bit much, but
no, that's fine. No, that's fine, Rebecca. Thank you. That was really interesting. And there we go. John has put clap, clap, clap in the question panel. So thank you, John. So yes, we are hoping to, in terms of CIWEM events, we're hoping to do a few more webinars over the next few weeks, and we're trying to transfer our events over onto Zoom so that we can carry them on. And actually, if we see a lot of people joining, like we did this evening, we had way over 50 people watching today, then we will sort of maybe start to try and put them more online into the future as well. When life goes back to normal. We have got the next webinar coming up, so put it in your calendars. I know you might be busy, but hopefully you're free, and that is on the 29th of April. NFM, Scotland Modelling of Elston Water, with Barry from JBA Consulting, who is a colleague of our chair, Alice Gent. So put that in your diaries. 29th of April, it will be a similar time, 5:30, 6 o'clock. And there'll be emails going out from CIWEM, but please check the events page as well. So one final thank you to yourself, Rebecca. And yeah, everyone have a nice evening.
Stay safe.
Yep, and stay safe and wash your hands. Thank you very much. Cheers, guys.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.